Hello, hello. Welcome everyone to Demand Curve's first growth summit. We really wanted to put on a conference that's genuinely useful with technical sessions to overhaul your company's growth strategy over the next couple of days, and really honored to have you join us. Thank you so much for taking the time. The format of the sessions will generally be a moderated panel followed by a Q&A. So feel free to ask questions in the questions panel on the right-hand side for the Q&A segment towards the end of the session. I'm Adil Razvi. I'm a founding team member at Demand Curve. I run sales and partnerships, lead live content, and I previously ran community growth for the company. Today, I'm joined by Kinsey Grant. She is the co-founder of Smooth Ops, and that helps content creators operate and scale their business. She's the host of Thinking is Cool and was the founding host of Morning Brew's Business Casual podcast. Thank you so much for joining us, Kinsey Grant.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here and have some fun, answer some very thoughtful questions. I'm amped to talk community and growth and content and all of that good stuff.
Let's go. I love it. Well, yeah, let's go ahead and jump right in.
Sounds good.
You left an established community at Morning Brew to kind of do your own thing.
Yes, I did.
I'm curious, what did you learn about community and community growth through that experience?
Yeah. So, I graduate, I'm still relatively early in my career as far as media goes, and especially as far as somebody who covers business goes. I've only been in the working world for about 5 years now. My first year, I was a very kind of straightforward, down the line, expected to have a career at a company, kind of a worker bee. I was a stock market reporter, and I had this very grandiose idea of what that might look like before I started actually doing it, right? And then I started and I realized that I was really capped in terms of creativity and in terms of actually reaching people who I felt were more like me. A lot of the content that I was creating when I was working for Jim Cramer, I was at the street, a lot of the content that I was writing there and the reporting that I was doing was geared toward institutional investors, old white dudes who had a ton of money. And that was definitely not where I was in my life and not what I was most interested in talking about and in bringing to the masses. And I was really lucky that around that time, after about a year of doing that, when I started to realize there's so much more out there in the media world, there's so much more out there to do in terms of storytelling, I got a message from Austin Reef, who's now the CEO and at the time was one of the co-founders of Morning Brew. They were just looking for writers. They just needed more manpower, in all honesty. And it was an opportunity that I jumped at because I saw that with this opportunity, I would be able to not only be more creative, to be funny, to have fun with the writing that I was doing, but that I would be able to do that with a community of people who were a lot more like me, people who wanted to engage in the same stories that I wanted to tell, people who would love to hear a joke about like hocus pocus, right? But also wanted to understand what Jerome Powell is doing right now. And I think that we were at this really unique position in the early days when I started at Morning Brew and I was employee 5, that we got to build all of this from the ground up. They had this great product when I joined. They knew what they were doing. They had a clear vision of what this could be. And that was incredible. But to be a participant in engineering, how that would grow, how that would evolve, how we would meet the needs of a community that was growing with us was such an exciting time to watch it go from, I think it was about 250,000 readers when I joined to 2.5 million by the time I left was crazy. And it's something that I'm incredibly grateful for, but it also just taught me so many lessons about what it means to build a community, because when you're building a community that is centered around content, centered around, in Morning Brew's case, a core newsletter and a lot of other offshoot products, that we're all kind of focused on the same goal of empowering young business leaders to understand the world around them, you have the really, really cool opportunity to drive what that content looks like, and in turn, what that community looks like and how that community interacts with you and the content that you're making. It's this sort of symbiotic relationship that I really loved being a part of. And of course, was difficult to leave, but certainly am just as excited about what I'm doing now and the communities that I'm focused on building now, but invaluable lessons, in all honesty. Those people really at Morning Brew know how to build community and how to engage with people in a really meaningful and authentic way.
I think it's so cool how you were able, authentic is sort of the word that jumps out at me, is just the way that you're able to bring your own personality to it in a like non sort of I don't know, like corny way. Like it's like legitimately like authentic, and you feel that as a consumer of your content. Like it's like, oh wow, she's being really real with us. And I'm curious, going from Morning Brew, where you were sort of you had like a whole sort of foundation to be able to grow that community off of. Like, what are some of the things that you've noticed, maybe some of the challenges or like some of the surprises that you've noticed, like going on, like porting over to your own platform?
Yeah, it's certainly been different. And in all honesty, anybody who's listening to this who has any hand in trying to grow a community around a podcast knows how difficult it is to grow an audio product as just a standalone audio product. Podcast discoverability is notoriously difficult to crack. And our approach has kind of been to not just be podcast, right? With Thinking is Cool, I have the podcast, but I also have newsletter and social and all of that. But it's tough. It's tough to start something from scratch regardless. It's especially tough to do it with just an audio product. So one of the first lessons that I learned that I'm grateful was early on, and I was certainly prepared for, was that, it's different to try to grow something from nothing when you're not capable of sending your first podcast episode to a list of, at the time, about 1.5 million people. We got that kind of built-in growth when we started Business Casual through the Morning Brew newsletter. And I think Morning Brew has done a really great job of appropriately creating those synergies around the products that they have and the communities that surround each of those products. The people who subscribe to, let's see, one of their newer products that I wasn't part of, HR Brew, right? These industry-specific newsletters. They have this really great knack for making sure that those readers know that a podcast exists, but they're not necessarily pressured to listen to Business Casual, and vice versa. I think that is one of the unique skills of a multifaceted media company that often a lot of young media companies get wrong. You're either trying so hard to push all of your content at the same time, or you're not promoting yourself enough. It's a difficult balance to strike. But I do think that was one of the biggest lessons I learned immediately upon starting Thinking is Cool, is that this is just going to be a different growth journey. It doesn't mean it's any less meaningful. It doesn't mean that I'm making any less money, right? Like, this is still a profitable product. It's still a community that's worth building. It's still something I'm incredibly passionate about, but the growth is a lot slower and steadier than, let's say, sending your first episode to millions of people, right? And of course, having that huge spike in growth, but then it kind of would plateau eventually. And we were prepared for that with Business Casual, but I think that's one of the biggest lessons right now, is that instead of the growth spiking and then just kind of plateauing, it's a slow crawl, and it's a little bit difficult to stay patient with all of that, especially having had that previous experience. But I am confident that the way we're building community with Thinking is Cool and with our other clients through Smooth Operations is better. This is sustainable. This is the way to do it. We're building smaller, more niche communities, but communities that are really deeply engaged. This isn't just something that you subscribe to and never listen to. The people who are listening to my show are people who are genuinely there to listen. And I think that is such an incredible privilege, something I don't take lightly, but it's a different kind of growth, and it's taken a little getting used to be completely honest.
Totally fair. And I think, and I want to drill into that a little bit because, what you mentioned around like podcast discoverability is really challenging, particularly if you're audio only and you don't have an existing audience. Channels like, Spotify and iTunes, it's really difficult to actually have your content surface, in those places. And one thing that I've noticed around your audience now, maybe even more so than when you were doing Business Casual, is just how high affinity your audience is. Like, the people who are paying attention to Thinking is Cool and pondering the questions around longevity and what is sort of like the state of drug use today. Like I feel like that people are super high affinity in a way that perhaps is distinct from when we were kind of doing it on behalf of a brand that wasn't your own. Have you found that to be the case?
Yes, 100%. And I think it's important whenever you're building a community that's centered around content to understand what you're asking of the audience when you're attempting to build that community. With Business Casual, the ask was honestly not all that big, right? I tried very purposefully to be the voice that would ask the questions that you wanted to ask yourself, but there is not a whole lot of expectation in terms of what you needed to know to go in. If you didn't know what EBITDA was, I would ask that question, right? But if you did, it wasn't a pain to hear that happen. With Thinking is Cool, I'm asking a lot more of my audience, and I'm acutely aware of that. I'm asking people to give me 45 minutes a week to think about a topic of conversation that's not easy to talk about. We're talking about climate change and should Greek life exist? And to quote one that you mentioned that I think was particularly heavy was, should people live forever? Like, these are not easy things to talk about, but that's the purpose of the show. The purpose of the show is to get people to talk about those things, to feel a little bit more comfortable having uncomfortable conversations or just being more thoughtful. So I have to be aware of that when I'm building this community, that this show might not be for everybody. I hope that someday it could be. I would love for everybody to be more thoughtful, but I have to be aware of the fact that this is just a different kind of media product. And that means it's going to be a different community. But with Thinking is Cool, the purpose has always been to build that really thoughtful group of people. Because even if, Thinking is Cool went away tomorrow, I would still have a couple thousand close friends who are really, really dedicated listeners and who are willing to be thoughtful regardless of what the issue at hand is. And I think that that is an enormous advantage right now for anything that we build going forward, to have this group of people who have been willing to be early adopters of the Thinking is Cool media ecosystem is always going to be valuable. I want to grow the community and I want to do it as fast as I can, just because I'm impatient and I want that. But I think we've been really, really good about understanding the value of that early audience, of understanding that they are the ones who are willing to commit the time to talk about difficult things, to respond to my emails, to humor me in any number of crazy, outlandish kinds of conversations. And they're going to continue to be that in our kind of media lifestyle and life cycle. So it's just a sense, I think, of understanding what you're asking of people when you try to build a community. What do you need from them? What are they getting in return for being part of that community as well?
Yeah, no, I like that a lot, and I can see how that like permeates everything that you do. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, just given your background around sort of content creation and now really stepping into this like community growth role, like how do you see the intersection of those two, like content creation and community growth? Is it are you thinking more around one over the other, and then that becomes like the major focus, and the other it's more of a byproduct? Or how are you sort of thinking about like content creation and where it meets with community growth?
Right. So in reality, I have to kind of be the Swiss Army knife, right? On some days, I am absolutely like blinders on, head down. I need to write a 14-page script today and record it and send it to my engineer for an episode, right? Like on those days, I don't really have the luxury of thinking about community. I say the luxury. I don't think about community on those days. And I have to be fully like honest in that. There are days when I have to focus on the content that's in front of me, because it is my belief that content, regardless of what you're building, if it is anything media related, even if it's not, it has to be at the center of what you're doing. And we've always been really, really adamant about that through Smooth Ops as well. Anybody we work with, the content has to be great. Otherwise, there's no sense in building a community around it. It has to be A+ across the board, as great as it can be, and with the recognition, of course, that everything can get better, but it has to be as good as it can possibly be at that moment before you try to build anything around it. I think that is super important, and something people often get wrong. If you're more given to building community than you are to creating content, you think, okay, well, I'll build it and then I'll figure it out. But I think that that's a little bit backwards. I think that it has to be the center of everything that you do before you decide to build something around anything, right? But I also think that there is this weird sense in the media world, especially, we have a pretty rigid idea of what content is. Content is, of course, the podcast that I put out every week. Content is the newsletter that I send out every Friday. But content is also this, right? Content is also what I tweet on a daily basis. If it's just random stuff that comes into my head, content is the voiceover TikToks that I do for fun because I like it. It makes me laugh. Like, we can't just approach content in such a rigid sense. We have to understand that whenever you're interfacing with another person, you're trying to create content that can at some point engender community. And I think that is a really important attitude to take when you're considering how content-focused communities can grow. It's not just through the podcast. It's not just through, swaps. It's not just through paid ad spend. It's through everything that you do online. I think that we would do ourselves a lot of favors if we kind of took a step back and realized like it doesn't all have to be so formulaic all the time. If you're having fun online, other people are going to want to come have fun online with you. And that's been kind of a growth hack for us, which is kind of crazy to think about. You know, it's not the most measurable, it's not the most quantifiable, but I think it works. And I think that we've done well in kind of emulating that idea of just making the internet fun again throughout a lot of the work that we've done with our clients through Smooth Ops as well. The people with whom we work are the kinds of content creators who view this as something that like they are so driven to do that they have no other option. They have to put this out there. They don't know what else they would do if they weren't writing this newsletter or making these YouTube videos. And that is super cool, right? That you can sense that passion, not only through their really polished work that they're putting out in newsletters and YouTubes and what have you, but also through everything else that they do in a public facing setting, that this is just their passion and they can't help but be excited about it. That gets other people excited as well. So I think that would be kind of the number one piece of advice following put the content first. It's also just like be a little bit more relaxed about what you consider to be content. Anything is content. We always say it at Smooth Ops, everybody is talent. Everybody can be talent if you want to be. You know, it's not this like, you don't have to take a test. I don't have a license. You go out and you do, and you talk and you have fun and you attract like-minded people. And that is what builds community. And of course, that's what builds community that's sustainable and that can continue to grow for the right reasons and on the right kind of tenets of what you're building.
It's so clear that you're having a lot of fun and it's infectious. It really is. And I think that's such a salient point that you have where content is really what drives the community in a lot of ways. It really has to be at the center. That might be a counterintuitive thing that a lot of people don't realize. You know, our own experience at Demand Curve. I mean, we sort of create this like, you know, best in class marketing content is really what we strive for. And that becomes almost a magnet for attracting the right people to what we're doing. And then as a result, they want to stick around and you know, be with other people who, you know, feel the same way. So I totally can relate to that.
Yes.
Let me see. So yeah, so one of the things I think that you probably have a good take on, given your experience with Smooth Ops and now that you're doing content creation and some community building for some of your clients, the impact of community is sort of difficult to measure from like a dollars and cents perspective. So how do you think about justifying like how do you think about like the ROI of community as a startup? You got limited bandwidth. Like how do you justify the resources to dedicate to community growth?
Yeah, it's incredibly difficult. And I think it's an important point to note, especially given that we are really small. Smooth Ops has existed all of like almost 4 months at this point. So we are like whatever earlier than the early days of this startup, that is where we are right now. So trying to figure out kind of where we go, given the resources that we have, has been a challenge, to be completely forthcoming with you. We're a small team. We want to continue to be a small team. We want to continue to just stay on course as much as we can and stay as focused as possible, as often as possible. But inevitably, we end up kind of wearing hats that we didn't expect to wear. And I think anybody who works in community can attest to that. Anybody who works in a startup can attest to that your job description does not always stay the same from day one when you sign on. And we've been really aware of that. And I think one of the important things to note here is that my 2 co-founders at Smooth Ops are also former Morning Brew employees, people I've done this with before. We have this incredible advantage of having already made a lot of the mistakes that we could have made, especially when it comes to building communities. We know what to avoid. Of course, we will make mistakes in the future. We will learn from the things that we are doing today, but we feel pretty uniquely positioned having had that experience before. We've built newsletters and podcasts before. We have grown them all before. We have a kind of special tool that we love now, especially trying to join or grow communities. And that is Jenny. Jenny used to be head of growth. She's now co-founder at Morning Brew. And now she's co-founder at Smooth Ops. And Jenny is just this incredible, like the most prolific community creator that I have ever had the privilege of knowing. You know, like she knows all of the secrets and the tips and the tricks and all of the everything to help build lasting communities. And I think that's an important point to note. You know, these are not just things that are going to work right now and then maybe people will stop using TikTok, right, and they go away or something like that. We're trying to build these communities around our creators that are really sustainable, that will continue continue to be worthwhile investments of time and content and brain power, not only 6 months from now, but hopefully 6-10 years from now. And because of that, we are helping these creators to be as multifaceted as possible. A lot of them are one specific medium focused right now, and we think that that's smart and the way to go. But we're trying to create an entire framework around all of these creators that allows them to explore other revenue models. It allows them to explore other communities that are maybe paid communities or audio focused communities or Slack communities or a job board or any number of different kind of community focused products that might not work today, but could work next year or 2 years from now, or even next quarter. And so I think that has been really, really fun to try to figure out on kind of an ad hoc basis. Your original question was, how are we figuring out where to go with the resources that we have? And I think the beauty right now is just that we're staying as focused as possible on our roster of clients as it exists today, understanding that they all have different needs, they all have different communities, and those communities have different needs. But we love the idea of building these really specific groups of people around unique, almost generational kinds of talent. And that's our focus. So, it could change in the future, and I'm hopeful that it will as the team grows. But right now, it's just recognizing that a lot of community building is kind of on an ad hoc basis, and that's okay. Getting comfortable, being a little uncomfortable. And of course, as they say in the biz, doing things that don't scale is okay, especially when you're in the early stages.
For sure. It's a little bit of a dance, right? Like managing community growth and sort of it's tough to really plan how things are going to shake out until you actually start building a community, realize how people are engaging with it, and you kind of go from there.
Yeah, and you have to be willing to be flexible and of course admit when you're wrong. Like it's okay. We are all allergic, especially in media, of saying, hey, I was wrong about this. It's okay when you're trying to strategize if you don't know all the answers when you're on day one. The beauty is that we are so nimble in the fact that we're a small team right now that we have the ability to adapt really quickly and to say, like, let's try this. This isn't working. Let's try something else. And also to approach any problem from a pretty unique perspective, given that we are at a lot of times this almost three-headed monster at Smooth Ops. We have Jenny, I mentioned before, who is this like growth guru, operational, can do anything kind of an attitude. We have Josh, who is the current CEO of Smooth Ops, who was a PM at Morning Brew, who helped me build Business Casual from nothing, and has also kind of built out a lot of their new products, or did when he was there. We all sort of left around the same time. And then I approach everything from this like content first view. So we get the content, we get the strategy, we get the ops. That's really cool. And we're really grateful that we could all kind of find each other and come together to create what seems to hopefully be a more holistic approach to any problem that needs solving.
I love the dream team that you've got.
Yeah,
You've
cool.
Not your first rodeo. You've done this before in a different context, and now you're going after it on your own. Let's get a little bit tactical here. I think yes. One of the things that I'm sure a lot of folks here are thinking is like, well, Kinsey, you were able to leverage the authority of Morning Brew. I don't have that authority yet. Like nobody really knows, who we are. If you were starting over today and you didn't have, you have the same knowledge, but you didn't have the sort of the experience that you could tout, or sort of an existing audience, how would you go about community growth in that context?
It's a great question. It's something I've often kind of wrestled with as I figure out what is, and this was a big question I was leaving Morning Brew too, right? What is enough built-in distribution? And I don't think that there is ever going to be an answer. There's never going to be enough, right? It's difficult to say, like, I had 20,000 something Twitter followers when I left. Was that enough? Who knows? It's what I had at the time. And I decided to make a move, and it paid off. I was lucky in a lot of ways. But I think that it's a question anybody who is trying to build something new will wrestle with. Do I have what it takes right now, given my existing set of resources? But I think you can often get kind of paralyzed by trying to answer that question, and you fail to recognize that the most important thing you can do, and I'll say it again, I'll keep saying it, is just create good content. Like, this is going to be dorky, but I'm going to quote Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come, right? Like that is exactly what my content approach has been. As long as I keep my head down and do really good work, the right people will show up. And of course, there are growth hacks, and there are things you can do, and there are friends you can make and hands you can shake. But I think at the end of the day, if you're not creating content that is worth building a community around, there's no sense in even trying to build the community. Now, that being said, I think there are certain specific things that can be done to ensure that that content gets in front of the right people. And number one, I think, is just focus. Make sure that the content that you're creating when you're attempting to build a community, even if it's around a product, right? A more specific product, not something like I'm building a podcast. Make sure that whatever that product is so hyper focused that the community knows exactly what they're getting when they sign up, when they give you their email, when they follow you on social or what have you. I think a lot of times we get so caught up in wanting to build a big community that we fail to recognize there's so much more value in building a more niche but more focused community of people who are deeply engaged with what you're putting out into the ether, right? And that is so important. So get focused. Make sure the content is good, and recognize that a big audience doesn't necessarily mean the best audience. It's a kind of a fallacy that I'm sure a lot of people have heard others in the growth world talk about before. But it's so much better to just have the kinds of people who are going to stick around, who are going to be brand evangelists for you, for your content, instead of just having a million people who never open up the email, right? That does you no good. And eventually, and maybe not today, that's perhaps a conversation for another time, but eventually I am confident that brand partners will come to recognize that too. You know, they ask about open rate. I don't know if they always know or, you know, click through or any number of these measures of what it means to have a community around something that you're building. I don't know if they always listen to the answer, but I think that it's going to become more and more important, especially as we get more used to existing as our online selves and building communities around online ad-based sorts of products. So those would be my first two things. Just, you know, content focus and focus on the audience itself. What are you building and why is it different from what exists today? I think especially in the podcast world, everybody thinks they should just start a podcast or anything, right? Like anybody thinks they should just start a newsletter. Like you can just go on Substack and do whatever you want. And that's great. Empowering people to be creators is fantastic. I will never speak out against that, but I will say, don't do it just to do it. Right? Like if you want this to be your livelihood, if you want to build a sustainable community, you have to be willing to put in the work to do something that hasn't been done, to build something that has not been built before, and to bring something unique to what is already a plethora of options in terms of content you can consume and products you can consume.
Totally fair. And given that this is a session on community growth, people might immediately jump to, well, it's just like, how do we get it as big as possible, as fast as possible? Which to be fair, like would probably be my inclination before really sort of digging into, well, actually, does it make more sense to focus in on a small niche that is genuinely excited about everything that you're doing and is a high affinity audience to focus on that. So is there anybody out there that you're seeing that's just doing a really great job? It doesn't have to be the biggest community as you mentioned, but like who's out there that's just like crushing it on the community front that you're like, oh wow, how are they doing that? Or just something that's gotten you excited?
Yeah, so I think that there are a couple of hyper-focused communities I'm in New York City, and there are a lot of really cool kind of community driven, even like spaces. One that comes to mind is a place called Happy Medium in New York City. They do some events, but it's like an art cafe essentially. So people who are inclined to the artistic talents, right? They go there and they have a space, but that is also a community. It's not necessarily super scalable, but I think they're scaling it in a really meaningful way of creating a group of like-minded people who will come to an art show, who will go to an event that's being hosted in this place. But I think beyond that, there are so many today, like so many non-traditional media outlets that are doing an incredible job of building community. And one that comes to mind immediately is Thing Testing. I think Thing Testing, and they have great content. I'm a big fan of Natalie at Thing Testing, but they create this idea of, not only is this a place where you can go to get honest reviews or to discover new brands, but you're also going to get what's actually really great content, really great original content that's kind of based in reporting and based in authenticity and honesty, that is just the perfect marriage of the value prop of the entity itself, which is testing things, and the idea that people want to have a relationship with the community that they're building around this business in the first place. I think they're doing a fantastic job. And I know that has been a pretty concentrated effort toward growth. They have been really methodical about the way that they've grown this entity, and I respect the hell out of it. I think they're doing a fantastic job, and it's just like really pretty content. They do a really, really great job of being thoughtful with what they put online.
Cool. Yeah, and I can hear that even in that first and the second example, like there's a lot of fun involved in what they're doing, and there's something very infectious about that, where like it's sort of like the crux of community. It's like you want to hang out with people who are having a good time, right?
Yeah, it's true. And I think that we talk a lot, and maybe this is just because it's something that I am obsessed with talking about with my team, but we talk a lot about what it means to build a brand. Like, what is my personal brand is a question that I have had to answer more times than I care to admit over the last couple of years. Like, what does it mean to be Kinsey Grant, internet person, trademark, right? Like, what is that personal brand? And I hate the idea of having to come up with that. Like, I absolutely detest the idea of having to have a calculated presence on Twitter or TikTok. Like, why can't I just go be myself? And of course, like, we present different versions of ourselves given different circumstances and different situations, and that's totally natural and human. But I think if we were just a little less calculating about who we are online, we would all have a lot more fun, and you just attract people who are just like you. And it's a more natural fit, not only for the content you're creating, but for the community you're building. I'm building a community of people who I would want to hang out with in real life, and that is such an advantage and such a win. And I think something that's often undervalued, because it's not very easy to measure the ROI of being yourself online, but it will pay off in spades, I'm confident, in the future.
Cool. One thing before we hop into the question and answer is I would just love to hear, you've mentioned around how some of these things are changing around community, and it's become a little bit of a buzzword almost these days. I'm curious to know, given the excitement around Web3 and NFTs and just sort of, the idea of community and what it means to a business is just rapidly evolving. I'm curious how you see things playing out over the next few years.
Yeah, we're going to have to get my other co-founder, Josh, in here to talk about Web3 and DAOs. I think that necessarily so, regardless of what your business is. For me, it's content, but regardless of what your business is, there has been this necessary reckoning of, people want to follow people. They want to be surrounded by other people, whether that's in real life or whether that is online in a forum like this. We connect so much more effectively with other people than we do with just a brand that exists. And that's why so many businesses, regardless of what they're doing, what their value prop is, have come to understand that they need to build community, not only as a marketing ploy, but also as a means of just creating a more effective strategy for what it means to go to market with a new product, for what it means to get word of mouth, right? For what it means to just be a brand that is good enough to have brand evangelists in your back pocket should you need them. And I think that has been really encouraging. With the rise of these new ideas of what community can look like, I think that we're going to see even more changes, right? It's going to be more than just a list of emails as your community. It's going to be, how do people gather in the metaverse? It's going to be, how do people gather in real life? Like, sue me for saying it, like it's a crazy idea today. But after the 2 years that we've had, I think that we just want to gather however we best can. And I'm encouraged a lot by the idea that a lot of new businesses coming to market today understand the value of that community from day zero. And that's incredible. It's not a game of catch up. It's a game of figuring out what kind of community best suits what you're building and why you're building it, of course, as well. If that is some sort of like DAO, who knows? That I'm sure there are plenty of brands that are going to market with a strategy like that today. Whether like that for us has been some in-person events, not super scalable, but incredibly valuable for thinking is cool as a brand, to understand, to get face-to-face time with people who are listening to the show, to align ourselves with other brands that we really, really value, who we really respect. That's been really, really important for us as we're in our early days of figuring out what comes next for thinking is cool. So I guess in terms of what changes, I think it's just no longer a blanket strategy to building community as a tool for growth. There are so many more options today than there were even 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So that to me will only continue to grow in terms of how many options there are. And of course, what we take as startup founders, I hate calling myself an entrepreneur, but like as entrepreneurs become entrepreneurs, they can figure out what works for them. There are so many more options today, and that's never a bad thing in my book.
For sure. And I can hear that, you know, although the channels may change, it may look like a metaverse versus in person versus whatever we're doing now. Sort of the principles of what you're sharing around create great, fun content like that. That'll never go out of style. Like that's still going to be sort of the core of it.
Yeah, such a good point. And, you know, inevitably, some of the big fads for community building today will peter out. We'll figure out that some of it doesn't work. Some of it will get too expensive. Some of it just won't be worth the investment anymore. But to your point, at the end of the day, as long as you know what you're bringing to the world and you know what the world can get in return for participating in whatever you're doing, if you know what those answers to those questions are, you are set up for success regardless of what the channels are. I think that's a really great point.
Let's go ahead and hop into some question and answer. I know we've covered some of these in some flavor, so feel free to go in depth or as little as you'd like. The top voted question right now is, what are the first steps that we should do when building a community? Where to start? And do you have any mistakes that we should avoid? Now, I know we've talked a lot about creating just that really high quality, fun content. What else would you say that people should keep in mind?
Yeah, I think that this is, asking about mistakes is always a great way to start. I love this question. I think for me specifically, the number one thing to focus on, and we've talked about this before in this conversation already as well, is the idea that whatever you're building, whatever kind of community you're building, it's going to have different needs based on whatever you're bringing to the market, right? For me, I was bringing, with the launch of Thinking is Cool, a podcast and a newsletter to the world. And I was hoping to build a community around this podcast and newsletter. If you're bringing a line of like direct-to-consumer olive oil, like your community is going to look different than mine does. For me, I think I put a lot of stock in some of the more classic media growth hacks that don't necessarily work in today's day and age. My distribution for the most part was on Twitter. That's where I had the most followers. But eventually it got to the point where it wasn't fun for me to tweet anymore. It was a chore. And I was doing it because I felt like I had to, because that's where the numbers were. And that was a mistake. That was kind of a waste of my time, in all honesty. Trying to farm for content on Twitter is like finding a needle in a haystack. It's never going to work out, at least in the short term. So I have kind of pulled back from that and recognized that maybe going TikTok first is a better strategy for me. I've created a kind of small but fun community on TikTok. I get to have fun doing it. It's not all about my podcast content, but it's about this is who I am online, and who I am online is who I am in the podcast. So that has created kind of synergy around that specific community. But I think the lesson in all of that was just that the traditional ideals for what building a community look like don't necessarily have to apply to what you're doing. If you're doing what feels good, you might not be able to measure it immediately, but it will pay off eventually. And that was something that I had to kind of get comfortable with, especially coming from my morning brew experience, where growth was pretty measurable pretty quickly. We were an email company for the first couple of years that I was there. And emails, you can measure really easily how well you're growing or how you're not growing. And you have to kind of retool your ideas of what success or the lack of success, I won't say the F word, look like in terms of growing a community. But be willing to try new things, be willing to step back and say that, hey, this traditional growth hack doesn't work for me. This channel's not working. That's okay. And be willing to make that decision relatively quickly.
Got it. What would you say is the best channel to create an engaging community? And some of the examples that are being given are like Facebook groups or Slack or like a custom built space, or is it merely in the comments section of the content that you're creating? I'm curious what you think about sort of a intentionally curated community approach versus just letting it happen as almost like an emergent property of the content that you're building.
Yeah, this is an interesting question. And my gut answer is that I almost kind of feel like I'm building two communities at any given moment. The community that I have on TikTok, and maybe less so now than it used to be, on Twitter, in my DMs, on Instagram, on social particularly, that is the community that's trying to inform what I'm going to cover in the podcast, or has some great idea of a guest I should interview. We have a mutual friend, Sagar, who I encountered because I asked people on Twitter, who should I interview for this episode? I need help sourcing ideas. And that was really useful. That was a big W for me. But I think that that specific facet of my community is very different from the community that we've built with Thinking is Cool on Slack. We have about, I think it's like 330 or so people in a Slack community for Thinking is Cool right now, which is like, it's pretty cool that, you know, we have 20 episodes in and you have a couple hundred people who are willing to join Slack to talk about the episodes or to talk about, you know, some follow-up that I want to do on an episode. They're more thoughtfully engaged in the content that I've already created. And those are the people who are the biggest brand evangelists for the content that I'm making through Thinking is Cool. Are they necessarily going to, you know, give me ideas for people to interview? Maybe not every day, but those are the people who are willing to opt in a way that's not necessarily easy. And I think that that's an important idea, you know, recognizing that you have this broader ecosystem around the community that you're creating, but within that ecosystem, it's okay to have kind of like sub-climates of people who do this to help you grow and people who are your evangelists and people who are going to reshare your TikToks. Like all of these can be kind of separate entities within this larger community. Hopefully there's some overlap. Hopefully the Venn diagram has like a big giant chunk in the middle, but if it doesn't, that's okay. And you can use these tools in a focused approach to take as much advantage of them as you can.
I just once again just love your focus on affinity, where it's just really about connection and not about like the bottom line, you know, audience growth number. Which brings me to this question of like, what kind of metrics do you use to measure the value and impact of community-driven growth activities?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult, especially with having multiple different levers that I pull, trying to, and I'm speaking a lot right now from Thinking is Cool, just because that's like the community that I am specifically building myself with, you know, that is a client of Smooth Ops. But we, of course, measure, you know, downloads for the podcast, number of subscribers to the newsletter, what the open rates are, what the click-through rates are. But in all honesty, a lot of that are just like reporting metrics for brand partners, which are important and we need to have. And that's how I pay my bills. And that's the end of the story, in all honesty. But it's a little bit more difficult to measure how you build a community, especially using something like your number of followers on Instagram and Twitter and TikTok and LinkedIn and Facebook. Like, I don't think that is the measure of success, you know, the perfect measure of success, especially for somebody who's like building a community around content that is often deeply personal and is certainly not for everybody. Like it's difficult to say, I lost 20 followers on Twitter, so therefore like my community is shrinking. I don't necessarily think that's how it works, but you have to be cognizant of those things, those numbers, unfortunately, for better or worse, because they are in some ways kind of like the directional indicator of whether your community is growing or not. I think day to day, it's not worth following. Maybe month to month, quarter to quarter, worth keeping an eye on. But also there is a lot of value. And I'll say it again, like doing things that don't scale can be really valuable. For me, that's responding to every single email that I get about my content, about everything. Like I will respond to every single email. But the fact that people are willing to reply and say, here's what I think, that is an incredible measure to me of how deeply you're building relationships within that community. You can get as broad as you want, but to go deep with people, deep enough that they want to respond and share a story or offer their perspective is so incredible. One of our clients through Smooth Ops had like a typo in a newsletter recently and got a bunch of emails of people saying you have this small, like tiny little typo that the copy editor didn't even notice. You know, like the fact that people were reading that closely is something to be proud of, right? Of course, you want to avoid typos if you can, but it's so cool that 10, 20 people were willing to respond and say, hey, by the way, you spelled this wrong. Like that's so cool that people are reading that closely, and not necessarily the most measurable community driver, but certainly an important one to recognize that like there's a win in that.
Got it. Yeah, it sort of you know, skip the vanity metrics if you're going to, you know, kind of zoom out and look if directionally you're on the right track, and then you know, measure if you have a high affinity audience by slipping in some typos in there.
Yeah.
see if that gets you on.
Yeah. And you know, also like I will recognize that a lot of my experience is in building like podcast and newsletter communities. But if people do have more specific questions about specific products, my DMs are always open. Like I would love to chat about your specific ideas of what is working and what isn't working. Because I know a lot of my answers are kind of blanket answers about growth in general, but I also do have a fantastic team of people who have perhaps more specific answers about what can happen and what cannot happen in terms of growth.
We're going to wrap up with just a couple of questions. How, and I know, again, we've touched on this in some ways, but this is by far the most upvoted question. How did you get your first 100, first 1,000 community members? And how much did your existing brand play into that?
Yeah, so it's a tough question to answer because, like I said before, I was starting my most recent endeavor with quite a lot in my back pocket, right? Knowing how to build a podcast, having done it before. I don't want to pretend like I know everything. A lot of it was luck. Of course, the harder you work, the luckier you get. But I was lucky to have had this experience before. This is not the first podcast I've built. And now because of Smooth Ops, this will not be the last podcast that I build. And I am so thrilled to have that be my personal reality. But I think in terms of how much my existing online brand or online persona played into the early success for Thinking is Cool, it's a good amount. There's a decent amount of crossover. And I can recognize that in the number of people who email me asking why I'm not talking about the Fed more often. I still have a lot of that business audience crossed over to Thinking is Cool. But beyond that, when I was starting at Morning Brew, I didn't have an audience, right? I got to send that first email that first episode in the Morning Brew email to a ton of people. But for me personally, there was no Kinsey Grant community. There was no community around the content that I specifically was making myself. We didn't even have bylines in Morning Brew until very recently. So there was that first 100 was kind of clawed at, right? I had to be everywhere. I had to be willing to do things that made me uncomfortable, had to do events. I had to record front-facing video every week talking about what I was building on the show that week or what I was covering. And I think that those small things eventually created a community of people who felt like they knew me really well. And that was really, really important, to the question of getting those first 100, those first 1,000 people in the door. I think it's allowing them to connect not with, and I'll talk about business casual because that was the first thing that I built that felt really mine. The first 100 and 1,000, I think, were people who recognized this isn't just a show where somebody interviews somebody else. This is a show that is informed by Kinsey's experience. This is a show that is hosted by a person who has a personality, who is willing to make shitty jokes and ask stupid questions because she's human. And that was so important. So offering that human connection early was a real driver, I think, for the early success of business casual. And of course, if you can, send your first episode to 1.5 million people.
Small undervalued growth hack there. So, what I'm really hearing is when you're starting out, be everywhere, do things that don't scale, be personal, engage with every single person like a human being.
Yes.
And really the underline is sort of just be authentic and fun.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay. Are there any specific resources that you'd recommend for someone to look into who's wanting to grow their community or think about community growth? Or are there any anything that helped you along your journey?
Yeah, I think one of the most valuable lessons I learned early on in my career in journalism was if you want to be a really good reporter, you have to read really good reporting. If you want to be a really good writer, you need to read really good writing. And that is, something that we, especially when you're in the media world, you don't want to emulate somebody else's product. You want to bring something new to the world. And I think that there is a difference between drawing inspiration from something that somebody is doing really well and completely being a huge total copycat. I am a big believer in reading as much as I can, as trying to consume as much of the online world as I can, and in measured specific doses, right? There's a time to go offline. But if you want to build a great community, join a great community, understand what's working for these people and understand how that may or may not work for you and what you're trying to build. I think that is often an underrated kind of growth hack. It's just understand what's working in the world in general. And if you can do it, great. If not, that's okay. Join another community and figure out what else you can learn. So just take that into consideration. If you want to be really good at something, follow people who are already really good at it.
Find who's doing it best, join, discover, reverse engineer, really figure out, what's making that tick, and see how you might be able to apply those principles to what you're up to.
Absolutely.
Awesome. All right. Well, tell me about Thinking is Cool. Tell me about Smooth Ops. I'm really curious to hear from you, what you're up to.
Well, thank you. Yeah. So I'll start with Thinking is Cool. This was the first product that we launched earlier this year. I, like we've talked about before, was at Morning Brew for quite some time, and eventually kind of got to the point where I just wanted to build something again. I was really excited by the prospect of building a new community, by the idea of building a community, especially around content that was so deeply personal and something that I felt really, really passionately about making. And I'll talk about Smooth Ops in a second, but I think that this tends to be one of the more universal factors around the creators with whom we work through Smooth Ops, is that they're just so moved to create this content that they can't do anything else. Like, even if I was writing to one person, I would still want to do what I'm doing. And I think that has been a real defining factor of Thinking is Cool. We're taking on generational kinds of issues that are not easy to talk about, in the hopes that we can encourage people to just have better conversations. It's kind of our tagline. We'll make your next conversation better than your last, because we're encouraging people to be more thoughtful. We're encouraging people to recognize that it's okay to change your mind when you have more information, doing our best to present people with new ideas of the world around them, and hopefully having some fun doing it. I approach every single episode of the show as my full authentic self as much as possible. I talk about my life. I talk about my personal life. I've cried in episodes of this is just who I am. And it's kind of my passion project. And it's so cool for me to be able to do that for a living. I recognize just how privileged I am to be able to do this. It's so much fun, and I'm having such a blast doing it. So that's kind of the Thinking is Cool part of my world. It's podcast, newsletter. Season 2 just ended. You can find it on any streaming platform, everywhere, all the time. We're everywhere. And then I send out a newsletter that's kind of Mondays and Fridays when I'm in season, but kind of sporadically otherwise. Have a bunch of interviews coming out to get us to season 3. So the interviews will kind of just be fun, to continue the conversations that we started in the last 2 seasons. Those will be coming out over the next couple of months. And then season 3 will be in probably mid to late January. We will be launching season 3 of Thinking is Cool, which is crazy to say that I have season 3 of my very own show. I'm so amped on that. But while we were building Thinking is Cool, and I say we, meaning my now 2 co-founders through Smooth Ops, we recognize that what I'm really good at is writing podcasts and newsletters and being creative. Those are the things that I'm good at and the things that I like to do. I'm not good at understanding Excel. I'm not good at finding brand partners. I'm not good at writing ad scripts. There are a lot of things that I don't want to do. I would so much rather spend my time doing what I'm good at and being really good at that. And so we decided that there should be a solution to this problem that a lot of creators are facing. Super encouraged by the advents in the creator economy, and just by how many people are joining this new space and bringing so much to it in doing so. So we created Smooth Ops to essentially empower creators to just build and scale businesses so that they can focus on what they're good at. We will do what needs to be done to allow you to be always the CEO of your own company, but also just to do what you feel you're best at. We'll handle everything else to make sure that this becomes a scalable, sustainable business centered around what you love doing. And that is what we're doing with Smooth Ops. We have a great roster of clients right now. I'm super excited about all of the growth that we've experienced in the last couple of months, and we'll continue to experience into the end of the year, into 2022. It's a great time to be in the creator world and in the community world. I am every single day encouraged by what we're doing. It's kind of crazy to think we had a business kind of catch up earlier today. It's crazy to think that we're running a business. Who gave me the right to run a business, But it's awesome to see all of this come into play, and to surround myself every day with cool, creative people who are just doing what they love. I am so lucky. I have the best job ever. And if you are a creator, come talk to us. We would love to hear from you.
Thank you so much for being so generous with your time today, Kinsey. This was a lot of fun. I hope that folks have gotten some sense of how they ought to be, at least some frameworks and mindsets around community growth. I really appreciate the time that you put in today. Thank you very much, Kinsey.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. And again, if anybody wants to catch up in a more one-on-one setting, I am all over the internet, as I have said. So come by me. I would love to chat. I am open to any DMs. And my email is kinsey@thinkingiscool.com. As I said, I'll respond to anything. Come chat.
Find Kinsey on Twitter, on TikTok, via email. She's everywhere.
Yes, very online girl.
Awesome. I'll see you backstage, Kinsey. Thanks, everyone. We will be getting started with D2C growth in about 5 minutes. Yeah, stay tuned.
All right.